All right, the last concept we're going to talk about today is something called a CSS variable. Okay. And understand variables, let's go back to like high school math class for a second. Okay. Excuse me. So if you had an expression like this, x plus 1, well, the thing about x is x could be different numbers. X could be 1, x could be 2, x could be 3. Okay. So a variable by definition is a value that varies or changes, or at least can change. Okay. In other words, it's not constant. Okay. Now, how we can use this in math is something we call variable substitution. So if I have an expression like this, x equals 1, x plus 1 equals, question mark. The idea is if you know what the value of x is, you can do what's called variable substitution and plug it into the second equation. So in other words, since we know that x is 1, I can then put the value of 1 here, and then it becomes an expression of 1 plus 1, and then the total expression of the statement is 2. Okay. So great, refresher of high school algebra, right, and all that. How does this relate to CSS? Glad you asked. Well, let's go to exercise 12 here, okay? And before I do anything, I just want you to kind of look at the HTML and CSS. So I got a container, and it's got a couple of paragraphs in it and a H1, nothing crazy. And this is what it looks like, okay? And if you go to the CSS document, you'll notice that I've used various CSS properties that we've talked about, like background color, like border property, color property, right? And one thing I want you to notice how we keep actually using the dark blue a couple of times here, right? So it's being used on the background color for the body. It's being used as the text color of the H1. It's being used as the border color here. It's being used as the border color there on the paragraphs and such, right? So let's just hypothetically say that I wanted to change these colors from dark blue to maybe a different color. Because they're all individual statements, I would have to come in here and change it. And I changed this to red, but that only changed that one there. And then essentially what I'd have to do is come into here and change that, and come into here and change that, and come into, here and change that, right? That's a lot of work just to get this result that I wanted, okay? What we can do, and this is kind of a newer concept in CSS, is we can create something called a CSS variable. The point of the CSS variable is it can hold a value, and then we can substitute that value into our CSS document. Okay, I know that's a little confusing at the moment, so let's just kind of walk through this together. The first thing you want to do is you want to declare a variable. Okay. The way I recommend you do it right now is we're going to use a new area of our document object model called the root. Okay. The root is the base of your HTML document. In this case, for exercise 12, it's like basically this. That is your root. Okay. And what we're going to do is we're going to define a variable that we're going to use in our CSS document. The way you define a variable is you give it a name, and just like with other classes and IDs, no spaces, no special characters, don't start with a number. Okay. The other way you do it is you also start it with hyphen hyphen. Okay. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to create a variable called main color, and the way I'm going to write the syntax is hyphen hyphen main color. Once again, don't set a no spaces, no special characters, that kind of thing. This is my variable name, and then I'm going to give it a value. The value I'm going to use for right now is dark blue, as such. Okay. All right. So I'm gonna go back here, and it doesn't really seem like anything's happening. And the reason why is I've set a variable, but I haven't actually used it anywhere in my SCSS document. It's kind of like, like last module we talked about animation. It's kind of like setting up keyframes and then not actually calling it or something like that. It's the same idea. It's like if you don't call it, you're not going to see it. So what I'm going to do is let's use this variable in my body section. How are we going to do that? Well, remember how we just talked about various CSS functions? There's another function we can use, and it's called var. What var allows you to do is pull in an existing CSS variable. So what I'm going to do is say var, and then my argument or the value here is going to be the name of my CSS variable. Okay. What should happen here is it's going to take, what this is saying is go find the variable called main color and give me the value of that. Since the value of this variable is this, that's going to be put into here, dark blue. Okay. The result of this is if I did it correctly, you shouldn't see any change, and I don't. Okay. And now what I'm going to do is I'm going to apply this to here. I'm going to change the color of my text. So once again, I'm going to use var hyphen hyphen, and I'm going to call the name of my variable, which is main color. So once again, what this is saying is go get the value of the CSS variable main color, which is still dark blue, and put that value here. And so through variable substitution, that should work. Okay. And to be honest, anywhere where I'm going to use that color, we could do the same thing. So I'm going to come in here and say, okay, var main color, var main color. So all four of these are using this value. Okay. Here, 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 and here. And I'm going to come back and I'm going to save. Now, once again, this kind of feels like, David, why did we do that? That seems like a lot of busy work, right? When we could have just typed in the value. Well, here's how this is useful. You know how like when you set up a CSS document, if you change the value of the CSS value, like the color or whatever, it changes it on all your HTML pages, right? Well, if I were to change the value of my variable, that's going to change the value that all of these receive. So let's just say for the sake of argument, I go to my client and I say, hey, here's this document. And they go, oh, I'm not feeling this dark blue. What if we change that to a dark green? Okay. So instead of me, and let's just for the sake of argument say that I applied it like 20 different times in the document, rather than having to go find every single example of it, I can just go back here and say, okay, well, dark green. I'm going to go back and refresh, and all of these update. Or maybe I don't want green. Maybe I want it to be blue or purple. I'm just going to use like a hexadecimal number here. Save. Now this value is going to be substituted into all of these spots. And then we get that. Okay. So the point here is that we can use this to kind of speed up processes of making changes to things, right? This is why I didn't just call it blue, because maybe later it's not going to be blue. I called it main color because like, well, maybe the main color is going to change, we don't know. Maybe later on, we're going to want something a little different. So once again, I have a document here. This is exercise 14. Let's just take a look at everything before I do everything. I have a document with a container, and it's a little more formal. There's a lot of articles with text in it. Okay. And if I come in here, I actually am using a lot of different types of fonts. Okay, so notice how I'm using Arial Black here and here. And I'm also using, this is the navigation bar, I'm using Times New Roman, and I'm also using Times New Roman in the article. And let's just see what that looks like before I preview this, or before I do any CSS variables. So it looks kind of like this. So there's like a combination of two different types of variables here. There's the, Arial Black, and then this is Times New Roman. Let's just say for the sake of argument, I want to, I'm going to create a variable for that main font, which is the main font I'm going to use is just, Times New Roman. So once again, I'm going to use root. Root, remember, is so that we set this in the base of the document. And I'm going to create a variable, and I'm going to call it main font. Okay. So once again, no spaces, no special characters, don't start with a number. And the value I'm going to give it is Times New Roman. Okay. So I have declared a variable called main font, and I've given its value Times New Roman. Then what I'm going to do is come in here and let's substitute that variable that I just created. So I'm going to come in here. Let's use var. Var grabs the value of a variable, and I'm going to say main font. What that means is that if my main font variable is set to Times New Roman, that means that value is going to get substituted into here. Times New Roman. I'm going to save and go back, and it should look the same. And I'm going to do the same thing for article. Let's go in here and use var, main font. So it's being substituted both for here, but also the articles. Now, later on, like I said, maybe my client doesn't want to use that particular font. Maybe just for the sake of argument, they want to use Courier. All right, so let's switch out Courier here. Because because I'm changing the value, any place where I use that font, these should update both in the navigation here and in the article. And the result would be, well, these all turn into Courier. I might want to make a second variable. I'm going to call this secondary font. I'm going to set the secondary font equal to Arial Black. Just like I did for the first one, I'm going to come for the values here, var secondary font. So what should happen is this should grab the value of this. So that would substitute into here. In other words, it'll be Arial Black. And I'm going to do that anywhere where I was using Arial Black in here. So let's come in here and do that. Okay. Come back. Looks the same, but like I said, maybe I want to, maybe later the client's like, you know what, instead of Arial Black, why don't we use like a category like fantasy? Let's save. Let's go back. Maybe not fantasy. There we go. So see how fantasies this isn't a particular font name, it's just a category. Okay. Or I don't know. Maybe I'm gonna use Helvetica. Come back. Okay. It's now using Helvetica for everything. So you could make as many variables as you want. Just to give you guys kind of an idea, I'm going to go to SF State's website here, and I'm going to go inspect. You can actually find CSS variables in a lot of websites being used. So for instance, if you scroll down See where it says DT row selected. So that's these are all variables set up by the website. Okay. I don't know what these particularly do. I'd have to like kind of break it down, but I know they're variables that were set up by the developer. Let's go to Amazon. See how there's these color. Oops, whoa. Okay. If I scroll down, see how it says root and it's giving me these colors. I don't know why they give them these weird names like Nenchat or whatever. But anyway, these are also particular variables for particular colors. It's kind of weird, but anyway. Oh, I think it's being okay. I see what's happening, but anyway, that's what's happening there. So you can definitely see these being used. Okay. All right. Let's do something. I'm doing one more thing. I hope this hasn't been too confusing for you. Let's combine, we're going to combine calculations and variables together. Okay. All right, so here in exercise 15, I want to show you this kind of setup here, okay? So in this document, there is H1, H2, H3, your standard kind of things. And what I've already done is I've set up a root, okay? And the root variable is, or the CSS variable I created is called font size, right? This is exactly what we did, so I can set this as a number. Okay. The reason why this is important is you remember that we also worked with calc. Calc can take two numbers and add them together, whether that's numbers like 20 and 20 or 50% plus 20 or something like that. Well, here's what I'm going to do. I'm combining the calc function with the var function. So we actually have a function within a function here. So let me explain a little bit what's happening. What's happening is this is a variable substitution. So this number is going to go there. And this is going to become 10. Now, there's no other number or anything. So just this becomes 10. And so my H1 becomes 10. Here, once again, this substitutes in to be 10. That's this part. And then we have the times 2. So in other words, whatever value comes in here is going to be multiplied out by 2. So if this is 10 points, I should say, you multiply that by 2, the value of this 10 points times 2 with this calculation should equal 20 points. So in other words, the H2 should be 20 points. And if I take this here, we can make the, once again, this is 10 points. 10 points times 3 in this case is my calculation. So then my H3 becomes 30 points. Okay. So in other words, we're using this one variable in multiple values. And the point of this is so that we kind of use this value and it's going to change all of these. And if I ever come and change this, it's actually going to affect all of these automatically without me having to go to each individual item and make changes. So I'll do it as pixels, not points, because the browser is going to measure it as pixels anyway. So if I preview this, let's take a look. And let's look at computed font size, 10 pixels. Let's look at this one, font size, 20 pixels. Let's look at this one, font size, 30 pixels. Okay. If I go back and I change this value from 10 to say 20, well, what's going to happen is this becomes 20. This becomes 20 times 2 or 40. This becomes 20 times 3 or 60. All right. So you can see what's happening here is I'm using this one value to affect multiple things, which is pretty cool if you think about it. I could set up all of my text on my page to kind of be a percentage, like I could use variables and say, well, okay, I want the main text to be this, and then caption should always be 50% of whatever the main text is, and maybe the H1 should always be 200%, and so on and so on. You know what I mean? Does that make sense? Where it's like you can use that one number to kind of base the rest of your your CSS document on. You know what I mean? And if I ever make changes, like let's say I show this to my client and they go, oh, this looks a little small, rather than having to go into each one of these and change it individually, by changing this one value, I affect all of them. Okay. I'll show you one more. It's kind of fun. All right. What we got going on here. The first thing you have to understand is that there's different ways to measure color. Okay. So if I come into here, let's say I do a p tag and I do color red. This is one way to measure color, right? Another way to measure color is by using what's called a hexadecimal value. And you guys are very familiar with this, right? But there's other ways of measuring color in CSS documents. In the same way, I can measure my I'm sitting in front of a desk. I can measure that desk in inches. I could measure it in feet. I could measure it in millimeters or centimeters, yards and so on and so on. You can measure color in a CSS document different ways. The most basic way is usually a hexadecimal number, but there's other ways, including what's called HLS. Okay. What HLS stands for is hue, saturation, and luminous, also known as brightness. Luminous. There, I can spell. Okay. So, in other words, this is the hue number. This is how bright it is or how saturated it is. And this is the luminance value or the lightness. Actually, sorry, it's not luminous, it's lightness in this case. Okay. So this is exactly the same as this. Okay. It's just measured slightly differently. The reason why I'm using this is, well, these are numbers, right? So what I can actually do is I'm going to replace this number with a variable, a CSS variable. Okay. I'm going to come in here and I'm going to make a variable called color number. And I'm just going to set it to 0. Okay. Now, what's happening here is, well, this number is going to come in here and it's going to set that to 0. This is the light, this is the saturation level, this is the brightness level. Okay. Just to give you an idea of what that should look like, I'm going to go to my color picker. And if you type in 0 for the color number, what was it, 100%? Oh, sorry, 55%. And then this is the lightness value, 35. It should give me like a dark kind of red. You guys kind of see that? Now, in my next one, I'm using that same value, or I'm substituting the same value, right? The 0. But I've also used a calc to add the two together, 0 plus 50. So when you do that, what that's actually going to do is shift the hue a little bit. If we go back to here, and I change this value from 0 to 50, see how that makes it kind of like this mustard color? And then I make this 100 and it turns green. I make 150 and it's like a darker green, and then 200, and then 250, and then 300, and so on and so on. Okay. See how that hue number can change, give me different colors. Okay. So what should happen is this next number should be that kind of, kind of mustard green. And in this last one, it's the same thing. I'm taking this value, I'm adding 180 to it. So it's going to take that value and set the hue number to 180, which is kind of this aquamarine color. And if I preview this out as such, this is the result. Now that's cool and everything, but like the same thing is if I were to change the color number, all of the colors will switch accordingly. So for instance, if I come into here, now the color number goes 0 to 360. It's basically a color wheel. if you want to really kind of understand the logic behind it. So the way it works is that in the color wheel, the starting color, that's not a great one, but the way that it works is this is 0, this is 90, this is 180, this is 270, and then it comes back to 360 again. So right now we had 0, 50 was like there, and then 180 was here, right? So if we start at 180, the first number would be this. You add 180 plus 50, that's 190. So it'd be kind of over here in the blue area. And then if I add another 180 to 180, that should be 360, or it should go back to red. So let's see if that actually works out. If I change this number. See how it went blue, darker blue, reddish. Okay. So my point of all of this is, now I know this seems like a lot. You don't have to do this, but if you start to get kind of better at CSS, you might start going, I kind of want my colors to be based on each other. I have a main color and I have a secondary color. So if I change the main color, I also want the secondary color to change, right? Or if I change one font, I want the other fonts to go accordingly, right? So this is why we might want to consider using variables, because we can combine them with things like calc or other functions, and it would sort of update all of our work. Notice how by changing one number here, I changed all of these values automatically. You know what I mean? That's a pretty powerful thing to do. And it's something that saves me a lot of time. Okay. So just something to think about. All right. So I want you guys to try that out. That was, 12, 13, 14, 15, and 16.